Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Noali Vasquez, and I am joined by my colleagues Linda, Laura, and Kat. And we are here today to give you a presentation on Innovation Hub and just to break down a couple of the things that we all do here. As we get started, feel free to put your name, your location, your preferred pronouns down in the chat. And let us know if you've ever used a database before. We're really interested on hearing that. So for our agenda today, we will do an introduction to Innovation Hub. We will go over replication projects in the cutting edge learning community. We'll go over the submissions process, which we're actually kind of in the middle of right now. And we'll take questions from all of you and hopefully give you insight into Innovation Hub and all that it does. So what is Innovation Hub? Innovation Hub is an online platform that aims to facilitate peer learning, build the MCH evidence base, and identify and promote effective and equitable practices and policies. They are usually focused on having an impact on the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. And there's a lot of resources on this website. So first, we have the innovations database, which I think might be our most known component of the Innovation Hub. We have a lot of practices on there, but aside from housing practices, we also help build different orgs and practices up. So we have replication projects, cutting edge learning communities, which I mentioned before, and we will dive into these as the presentation goes on. And then we share the database submission process. So the MCH Innovations Database is the part of Innovation Hub that houses all of the practices across like, you know, the country and other regions. So effective practices, we'll start there. We have two sections, but we'll start with the effective practices first. This is out of order. I'm so sorry. But the MCH Innovations Database, the goal is to build the evidence base by identifying and sharing effective practices and policies from the field. The policies is a relatively new addition. We'll be really excited to share the rest of that and dive into what the policies entail later on in the presentation. But the practices and policies are what we feel represent what's working in MCH. So we have programmatic practices and initiatives. We have collaboratives and coordinated structures. They also include workforce development strategies, family and community engagement and partnership strategies, toolkits and curriculum, and big P and little p policies and procedures, which Laura will be she's super good at explaining all of that, explaining the differences and explaining the things that we look for. The Innovations Database, we have different ways of categorizing both practices and policies. For practices, we have what we call a practice continuum. And so we have these 4 different categories that practices can fall into. And as you can see, they kind of build up from cutting edge to best. And that's with continuous like improvement. We have practices that come back after landing in one of these categories and expand their program. They change things about it so they can move up the continuum. So each of them has particular characteristics before we, you know, designate any of them. So for cutting edge, it's the most basic level of our continuum. It's the first designation that practices can receive once they come to Innovation Hub. So the cutting edge will address a need. It'll benefit MCH groups. It'll advance health equity. It involves stakeholders and it shows signs of success. This is really like early work. We have a lot of like new practices that tend to fall into this category. From there, they can advance to emerging, which has strong logical and theoretical foundation. It has an evaluation plan, and I think this is the big distinguishing factor between like cutting edge and emerging. By now, they would have an evaluation plan to see how they're measuring their work and how well it is working in the community that they've set it up in. And then the emerging category also identifies and uses lessons learned for improvement. The next category is promising, which considers biases, conducts continuous quality improvement, has data that shows beneficial outcomes. So it's definitely building off of that evaluation plan from the previous designation. And it identifies and assesses unintended results. And so the last designation we have is best practice. And so the best category meaningfully engages stakeholders at all practice levels. By this point, to be considered a best practice, they would have had their work disseminated via journal, a toolkit, external evaluations, things like that. And something that we actually do like help others with is replicating, like their practice has been replicated by other people and it has had positive and similar results. So those are the different designations that we have. And when we consider the evidence that we're looking for from these practices when we're evaluating them for our database, we've tried to, AMCHP as a whole has tried to think of evidence holistically. And so it includes community preferences and experiences and input, something that we really look for to make sure that these practices are adequately suited for the environment that they're built for. Feedback from those with lived experiences, contextual evidence such as state and local data, input from professionals and providers, and scientific research studies. So we look at all of these things together because that paints a better view of the practice and the work that they're doing and how it's impacting its community. And so we work to recognize many forms of evaluation. And though in the past, there's a tendency to only consider using experimental data, like randomly assigning people into groups and control groups, we work to, just expand the general definition of what we accept for evidence. And there are other methods like pre-post assessments, collecting experiences, again, from those with lived experiences, and qualitative data so that, we get the full scope of the work that the groups are doing. So this is a map, and it is a quick overall summary of where we have practice submissions from. And so the gray ones, we haven't gotten any practices from there just yet. We're hoping to expand there. But we have practices from many other places in the country, this light blue right here. And then 3 to 4 practices from the states that are colored in this like sky, little water blue, I guess. And then 5+ practices from many other states in that dark blue. So we have quite an array of like different practices from different regions all over the country. And right now, we have currently been able to build our practice. So among the different categories, we have 31 in cutting edge, 60 in emerging, 54 in promising, and 26 best practices. So we have over 170 practices, which is, really nice for, to have such a variety of practices that people can look to and possibly replicate or possibly take, like look at an example that they might be able to recreate in their own communities. And I will now pass it over to my colleague, Laura, to get into the policy work that Innovation Hub houses.
Thanks so much, Noelle, for that introduction and for going over the practice side of things for the database. So as of fall 2021, I had to think for a second, what year is it? As of fall 2021, we expanded our database to not just feature examples of evidence-based and evidence-informed practices, but also policies. If you don't mind advancing to the next slide, Noelle. So really the goal of the policy track is to identify examples of model evidence-informed maternal child health MCH policies that policymakers and MCH professionals can use as blueprints to inform the development, implementation, and evaluation of future policies that will benefit MCH populations. So just as with the practice side of things, the policy track is really based in implementation science. All of the language and the way that we kind of describe this work is really focused on what would folks who wanted to replicate this work need to know, and really trying to take that implementation centered lens. So just as Noelle described, there are different designations in the practice side of the database. So those are cutting edge, emerging, promising, and best. And those are along a continuum. An important distinction with the policy track is that our designations are not along a continuum. They're more standalone buckets. So we have evidence-informed policy development, evidence-informed policy implementation, and evidence-informed policy evaluation. And those are our three main designations. And later on today, we're going to go through a little bit in more detail what we expect from each of those. These designations are we're going to talk about the submissions process, talk about the review process. It's very similar to the practices if you've been a part of that before. The link you can see on the slide here, and I believe it's going to also be dropped in the chat, is where you can go. Yep, Kat's already on it. Great. You can visit our website to learn more about this. Next slide, please. So doing a little bit more of a deep dive now for evidence-informed policy development, really what we're looking for here is that meaningfully involving the people most impacted by the policy in its development. So this is really thinking about partnerships and thinking about who are the policymakers partnering with. It's important, I should note here, and when we're talking about policy, we are talking about both big and little p policy. Big P policy, if you haven't heard these terms before, is a term that's often used to refer to what folks might think of when they think of policy, that legislative policy that requires lawmakers and policy advocates and all those folks. So that really legislative governmental policy. Little p policy is really thinking more about administrative policy, thinking more about non-governmental policy. So that could be an example of little p policy, could be a memorandum of understanding between a state health department and a local health department, or it could be included in your contracts. So there's really, or it could even be something within your organization, a policy within your organization that you feel is advancing equity and benefiting maternal child health populations. So we really think of policy holistically. So I just want to make sure to clarify that before we kind of jump into these different designations. As such, a lot of the work we do in maternal child health, even if you're not in your role influencing that big P policy, there's a really good chance that you might be doing work that is related to little p policy, or might be an example of little p policy. So back now to evidence-informed policy development. So we're looking for that meaningful involvement of those different partners, community partners, folks most impacted by the policy and the development of that policy. We're looking to see, is it addressing a documented need in some capacity? And were people with lived experience, those most impacted, involved in assessing that need? An example of policy development should clearly articulate its intended goals and outcomes, and should describe health equity considerations related to the policy, including disparities or differences in the impact that the policy might have on different racial and ethnic groups. Next slide, please. So thinking now about evidence-informed policy implementation, it's a lot of the same stuff. We expect the same things as we would for the policy development, but in addition, we're wanting to know, is it implemented using the best available evidence to guide implementation efforts? And so as Noelle said, when we're thinking about evidence, we're thinking about it comprehensively, not just research evidence, but also experiential evidence and some of that contextual community-based evidence too. We're also looking to see, are changes being made based on the unintended consequences or feasibility considerations? So as you're implementing the policy, are you assessing how things are going and then making modifications based on what you learn? And then lastly, looking at seeking input from key community stakeholders and partners during the planning and implementation process. Next slide, please. And then so for evaluation, it's a lot of the same things for the other two. We'll do a deeper dive into this in a little bit, but this is just to kind of ground folks. So we're looking, is there a strong evaluation plan and methods? Are you able to demonstrate the impact of the policy on the MCH populations that you were intending to support? Are you assessing intended and unintended outcomes, unintended consequences of the policy? And are you able to demonstrate how the policy advances health equity and addresses disparities? Next slide, please. All right, so with that, you've heard us talk for a lot, so we figured we would show you a little bit more about Innovation Hub. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully folks can see it. If I get a thumbs up for Linda, Noelle, or Kat, can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Thank you. Wonderful. So if you come to amchip.org, our wonderful website that we relaunched or gave it a makeover earlier this spring, under the resources tab, you will find Innovation Hub right there. So you can go to the overview tab, submit a practice to learn more about submitting a practice, submit a policy to learn more about policy, and replication projects, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But for right now, we're going to focus on the database. So this is what our wonderful database looks like. So when you come to the database, you see there's a lot of different ways that you can search for submissions. Designation type is policy or practice. So as we just launched the practice or the policy track in the fall, there aren't that many policies right now, but we can take a look there. Designation, it's by cutting edge. It's all the 4 practice designations or the 3 policy ones. You can search by your jurisdiction, the setting in which you're looking. So if you want to know what school-based practices are out there, you can search by school-based. Population. So we have the different population domains that are aligned with how we often talk about them in Title V, your topic area, and then national performance measures. So for the sake of today, let's check out our school-based results. So you'll see we have 13 practices related to school-based health. So let's take a peek here at the NC Project Activate Aware. So when you come to the practices homepage, you'll see we have the title. This one has quite a long title. Some basic information here laid out, a summary of the practice. Some include photos at the end if the folks decided to include those on their landing page, contact information, the practice website, and then really the key kind of meat and potatoes of the database are these implementation handouts. So in our implementation handout for the practice, you'll see there's a lot of information in here, and I'm just going to scroll through so you can see it, but we're not going to deep dive this together. But you can see kind of a high-level overview of where the practice is, the topic area, the setting, population focus, when it was added. So a lot of the same information you can search by. And then we break down our handouts into 2 sections. One is the practice summary, and then one is implementation information. So kind of goes an overview of what the practice is, what its goals are, the core components and practice activities, which is also included in a table, which can sometimes just, I find at least, a lot easier to kind of digest this information, the discussion of health equity, talking about the evidence of effectiveness, showing the practice is working. And then we get to the implementation guidance section. So that's really thinking about stakeholder empowerment and collaboration, who was involved throughout the process of the practice, replication, if it's been replicated, internal capacity needed to implement the practice, a practice timeline. And I know I'm going very fast, sorry if folks are getting a little dizzy. There's a lot of great information in this handout. So yeah, that's kind of a overview. And then really important, we have our lessons learned. So as I mentioned before, we really take an implementation focus to this work. And so lessons learned are really key. How can you learn from folks who've already implemented this if you're wanting to replicate this work in your own context, as well as next steps for what the practice is planning to do at the time of submission, and then additional resources. So that is a very quick overview of our database. I'm going to stop sharing now so Noelle can start sharing again, but we encourage you to check it out, check out the policies and practices in there. There's a lot of good information too about submitting, and we're going to deep dive that in just a little bit. But if you want to go to the next slide, Noelle, I believe I'm handing it off to Linda to talk about some of our other opportunities.
Yes, thank you, Laura. So like Noelle set us up at the beginning of this presentation for, we were going to break down the different aspects of Innovation Hub into explore, build, and share. So now that we've explored a little bit in terms of the MCH Innovations database, then wanted to tell you just a little bit about some of the ways we can help you to build or expand the evidence base. And so this will be our cutting edge learning community and our replication project. Next slide, please. So our cutting edge learning community, this is still a relatively new support opportunity that we launched a little over a year ago now, just about a year now. Looking at Laura, since she had this up, long time coming, but essentially this is a way for us to provide more intensive support and guidance to our cutting edge practices in the database. So typically after practices get designated as cutting edge, after they get added to the database, we'll reach out and let them know about this particular opportunity and see if they'd be interested in joining the overall learning community. And so it really is set up as kind of a pure learning opportunity. So folks come together on a quarterly basis to learn about a particular topic that will help them to advance their practice with the goal of having them resubmit at a later date to move up the continuum from cutting edge to an emerging practice or even higher. And so we created this opportunity recognizing that cutting edge practices are time limited in our database. That means that we usually keep them for about 2 years and really encourage them to resubmit. But we realized that without AMCHP, providing that support, it might be difficult for folks to have the capacity or bandwidth or access to the resources to help them to continue to enhance or improve their practice to then be able to resubmit. So this cutting edge learning community really came, from that need, and in that way, it's really a very wonderful supportive environment. So there is the opportunity for folks, like I said, to kind of come together on a quarterly basis to learn a little bit more about a way to advance their practice. So for the past year, folks have really been focusing on equitable evaluation. I know coming up, they have a focus on continuous quality improvement. So different things that'll help folks to advance to the next category or designation on our continuum, really kind of focusing on those different criteria that we're looking for those categories that are higher up on that continuum. And so again, peer sharing is a big aspect of this, but there's also an element of it being tailored or differentiated for participants as well. So I know Laura and some of her other colleagues that we work with at AMCHP are supporting these practices one-on-one to also provide additional support and assistance that's very specific or tailored to their particular practice and their needs. And again, the goal is that after participating in this opportunity, folks will essentially be able to, with support, resubmit their practice and then move up the continuum. So again, still a relatively new opportunity that we've launched over the past year that we're so excited about. So far, it seems to be working really well, but certainly open to other suggestions and ideas and ways that we can continue to make this an opportunity that really meets the needs of folks in the database. And then next slide, please. We're going to talk about our other technical assistance or support opportunity that we have. And so this is our replication project. So folks might have heard of this or might be somewhat familiar with it, but essentially on an annual basis, we offer, between 3 to 4 awards of between $15,000 to $25,000 each for organizations to either prepare to replicate or to actually start replicating a practice in the database that's either emerging, promising, or best. And so this really is a way for folks to, again, kind of peer share across different states and jurisdictions to learn from one another, to learn more about what it takes to actually implement a practice, what goes into that, how to maybe adapt or tailor that particular practice for the specific community or context in which you're hoping to implement it. And so on the screen here, you'll see just 4 of the different organizations that we are actually wrapping up our most recent cohort with. These folks have been with us for about a year now working on their projects and are, like I said, in the process of closing out their opportunity. Each of them is assigned a coach who is really a representative from the practice in the MCH innovations database that they wanted to replicate. And so their coach is really providing a lot of that context-specific guidance on, like, this is how we implemented this particular program or practice. From our perspective, these are the things that worked. These are the things you might want to keep in mind. So they provide a lot of that, like I said, kind of contextual implementation support. And then on AMCHP side, we provide a lot of, like Laura had mentioned previously, a strong focus on implementation and implementation of science tools and processes. So we have quarterly webinars that we do for our awardees along with our coaches, kind of focus on different implementation strategies and tools that are related to where they are in the replication process. So That, like I said, has been one of the technical assistance opportunities that we've had for very many years now, and we take a lot of pride in the fact that we've been able to incorporate a lot of feedback from previous awardees to really make this an opportunity that, again, is kind of meeting the needs of folks in the field. And so this is something that is an opportunity that's open to anyone who would like to participate. We certainly welcome you to connect with us if you are interested. We're happy to talk about this in more detail, but also encourage you to check out our website. And the last thing I would note is that we actually just closed out our request for applications, and so we have identified 4 new awardees, 4 new organizations that we'll be working with that we just started this month. So we have a new cohort, so we'll certainly be pushing out some additional information on what we're working on. And then the last thing I would share is that if this does sound like something you're interested in, again, we're happy to chat with you about this in more detail, but the next request for applications will actually be coming out sometime in the fall, most likely between October and November. So stay tuned from AMCHP Communications, and also checking out the replication project page on our website. We'll be sure to provide updated information there as well. Next slide, please. So with that, we wanted to talk about kind of the last process or kind of group of resources related to the last key feature of Innovation Hub, which is to share, right? So to share what's working in the field, to share that evidence. And so we wanted to walk through the database submissions process. So the way that we're going to do this, as we mentioned earlier, we have both practices or programs and policies in the database. So overall, high level, the submissions process is very similar for practices and for policies, but we do have a few differences. So I'm going to walk us through practices and what that submissions process entails, and then I'll turn it over to Laura to walk us through some of the finer details of what the submissions process looks like for policy. But again, there's a lot of similarities, so there might be some things that you hear more than once. So we'll kind of go through it the second time with the policy track and just really point out what the key differences are. So with that, talking about submitting practice. Next slide, please. So the first thing you might be asking yourself is, this sounds great, right? But like, what's in it for me? What do I get from submitting my practice to the database? Which is a very fair question, right? So here on the screen, you'll see just a few of the benefits that we've been able to identify by, reaching out and connecting with folks who are already in our database. We've asked them, from your perspective, like, what do you think? What is the value to you of being included or featured in the database? And so the first one, replication, right? This is connected right back to our replication projects that we just mentioned, but it's really an opportunity for you to share what you're doing that's working that others might be able to replicate or adapt in their own context. So a way to kind of spread what's working across the US. The next one, it's also an opportunity for you to receive some sort of recognition for your practice. So we'll touch on this very quickly at the end of the session, but and you'll hear during the AMCHP conference, but we do have Innovation Hub Awards where we recognize some of our practices and policies like throughout the year for kind of going above and beyond in specific categories. The other thing that's really nice is that regardless of whether or not you are accepted to the database, everyone who submits a practice or policy will receive feedback from our MCH reviewers. So these folks will provide specific feedback on things that they think you're doing really well. They might note some things that you might want to consider incorporating to strengthen your practice or policy moving forward. But regardless of getting into the database or not, everyone will get feedback that you can actually use or apply to your practice or policy moving forward. I think the next thing is also, kind of inherent in this work is that by submitting to the database, you are helping to, kind of expand our current understanding or expand the existing like MCH evidence base. So, right, that's built on our collective knowledge of what's working, in maternal and child health to address particular maternal and child health, or achieve particular maternal and child health outcomes. So by submitting to the database, you're helping to increase the understanding or awareness of what works and why it works. And then we're able to share that more broadly with other folks across the US so that they also are aware of what's working and what they're doing. I think the other thing that we wanted to highlight was this aspect of credibility. So we have heard this from a few folks that being in the database actually led to them, kind of increasing the chance of being or receiving funding. So this is something where they were able to indicate in their application or in their grant proposal that they were in the database at this particular category. And they said that that was very attractive to funders because it lent an air of credibility. So obviously we would love for your practices, and policies to be credible in and of themselves, regardless of being in the database. But this is something that folks have said, because people know AMCHP, it has been helpful to use or reference the fact that they're in the database to secure additional funding. And something else that folks mentioned too is that they kind of think of AMCHP as like, kind of the good housekeeping stamp of approval within like state MCH. So, again, kind of having that be in AMCHP's Innovation Hub also helps because folks might know AMCHP, which again kind of helps with that credibility aspect. And then the last piece, I think, is that, as we mentioned through the replication project, the cutting edge learning community, and just in general, the way that our team kind of approaches our work at AMCHP is that you submitting to the database is kind of the entry point for us to get you connected to all of these other types of support and technical assistance that our team and our organization can offer. But we can also use this as an entry point for connecting you with our different partners in the space as well, who we might be better suited for supporting you in your practice or policy moving forward. So again, these are not all of the benefits, but this is definitely some of the high level ones that folks have shared with us as a part of their being included or featured in our database. Next slide, please. So the submission steps, we have 3 steps. The first step is essentially to go to our website. So if you're submitting a practice, you'll go to the link here, which will bring you right to the page on practices. Kat has dropped the link in the chat. But if you go there, you'll see the different practice submissions form. You'll select the one that's most appropriate for you, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. You'll fill it out, send it back to us. So that's kind of the first step, is for you to submit your work, whether it's a practice or policy, and then we'll review it. And then once you're accepted to the database, you'll fill out a brief form, which is essentially helping to build out or provide the information for your practice page in the database that Laura showed us, that landing page that had the name of the practice, it had their logo, it had their contact information. So that's kind of the second step, right? After you get accepted, is to just share some of that brief information with us so we can start building out your landing page. And then the third step in the process is to then fill out that summary implementation guidance handout that Laura walked us through. So that's it, 3 steps. First one is just to actually submit the practice. And then the second 2 steps are all about kind of what goes in the database in and of itself. And I will say, as much as possible, try to streamline this process so that it doesn't feel like you're having to do a bunch of different types of things or collecting different information at different steps. We tried to make it fairly aligned for you. So that's a more seamless experience. In terms of when to submit a practice, so for practices, currently we do this on a biannual process, so typically in the spring and the fall. So like Noelle alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, we are currently wrapping up the spring review. And so the next review is going to be in the fall, and so that'll be around September. So if you are interested, this sounds like something you might want to do, start checking the website starting in August. We're hoping to have updated materials done for you to refer to, so like the submission forms, all of those different resources and materials. And then you send it to our evidence@amchip.org email that you can see here on the screen. So that is the inbox for our team. So any questions about Innovation Hub or just like evidence implementation work at AMCHP in general, you're welcome to email us at that email. Next slide, please. So what you see here on the screen, I'm not going to go through each one of these, each criterion on its own, but just wanted to share that, one of the questions that we get asked for practices is like, how do I know which of those 4 categories that Noelle walked us through, how do I know which one my practice falls into? And so this resource is essentially the different criteria that we take into account when we're reviewing and assessing your practice once it gets submitted to us. So this handout you can access on our website. Like Kat dropped in the link there. So if you click on the practice page, you'll see the drop down for this particular resource to help you to access that information. But essentially all of the criteria that you saw on that larger continuum at the beginning of the presentation that Noelle walked us through, those are the same criteria that you see here that are included in our checklist. So this is a good guide. One of the things that we can also do is we can, have you take a look at this. And then if you still aren't sure, like, oh, maybe I'm kind of in between cutting edge and emerging, or I'm not sure if I have enough to be considered cutting edge, we are happy to have a conversation with you. and kind of walk through the criteria, have you talk a little bit more about your work or the practice you're planning on submitting, and we can help you to then figure out the category of designation that might be most appropriate for you to apply to. But again, this is kind of just like a guide for you to use to help you. But if you ever get stuck, please reach out to us. You can just send us an email at evidence email, and we're happy to connect with you and schedule time to kind of figure out where you might fall. Next slide, please. And what you see here, this is just a screenshot of the 4 different submission forms that we have. So we have one submission form for each practice designation, which is why it's helpful to have a good idea or understanding of which category you think your practice falls into. So again, they're separate forms. Some of the questions at the beginning are the same across all of them, and a lot of that information is what we take and use to start populating your handout once you get accepted. But there are definitely questions that differ depending on the category the further you go in the application. So again, just double check and make sure you have the correct one, but we do have separate ones for each practice category. Next slide, please. Just a quick note about scoring. So once we receive your submissions, each practice is reviewed by 3 different reviewers. So these are folks that essentially, sign up to review practices. These are people who are, in the MCH field, who are very interested in being a part of this experience, who have a wide array of MCH relevant, experience and knowledge and perspective. And so what they are doing is they're looking at, a score form and with criteria that aligned with the minimum criteria checklist. So there are a few additional things that we're looking for overall, but everything is very much aligned with the minimum criteria checklist and the questions that you have in your submissions form. So again, we try to match as much as possible reviewers' areas of knowledge and expertise with the focus of the practice. But again, everything's being reviewed by 3 different reviewers, and they'll look for it, and then we have a conversation with them to kind of figure out, is this a good fit for Innovation Hub? Is it a good fit for the category that they applied for? And then we kind of go from there in terms of whether or not we ultimately accept it. Next slide, please. Again, screenshot of the handouts that Laura walked us through. So again, once you get accepted, this is what you would complete that would then be uploaded to the database. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to walk us through how to submit a policy and kind of emphasizing what those key differences are in the process.
Thanks, Linda. So this will be a little bit quicker just because, as you'll see, it's a very similar process. Noelle, next slide, please. So submission benefits, these will look very familiar because they're essentially the same benefits. They really center on sharing your successes with folks who may want to replicate your work, receiving that national recognition for your policy, receiving feedback and suggestions from the MCH experts reviewing your work, contributing to building the MCH policy evidence base in general. And I think this is really key, something that we've often heard as AMCHP from our members, and this is sort of a bigger conversation in the field, is just some feelings of not feeling fully comfortable or like have all the necessary skills to feel like you can engage in the MCH policy process. And so one of the things that we're really hopeful to do with having policies now in the database is to share some examples that can help you show you that a lot of the work you're doing might already be policy work, or you're able to look at some of these as blueprints for how you might be able to apply some of this work in your own setting. Another submission benefit is increasing the credibility of your policy approach, and connecting with AMCHP staff for ongoing technical assistance. And I should mention too, not just AMCHP staff, but also AMCHP's partners. We're currently developing what we're calling our Evidence-Informed Policy Initiative, which is a collaborative initiative with a lot of our different MCH-related partners to try to think about how we can best support the MCH workforce to engage in the policy process and apply more implementation-focused approaches to policy to their work. Next slide, please. So just as you saw, as Linda was talking about, there are 3 steps to the process. The first is completing the submission form. It's a different submission form, which is probably not surprising, than the practices. If you're accepted, you'll complete the database entry survey, and then you'll also complete your policy summary and implementation guidance handout. Next slide, please. So one key difference between the practice and policy track is that For the policies, we accept on a rolling basis. So submission forms are posted and updated just as with the practices kind of ahead of each of the reviews, but we accept policy submissions at any time. So you don't need to wait for the fall or spring review to roll around. You absolutely can if you would like to, but we accept submissions at any time, and those are returned to us at evidence@amchip.org. Next slide, please. So speaking now a bit more about the designation criteria. So you can think of this, as Linda just showed you, the minimum criteria checklist. This is similarly a breakdown of what we're looking for examples of each of these different types of policy. And for the sake of time, I am not going to go through this in detail, but it is, if you visit our policy page on our website, you'll be able to find the little screenshot of the document. There is the designation criteria. And so you can look through that more closely. They very much align with what you saw from earlier on when I was talking about what we're looking for each of those, just with a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Noelle. So these are photos of the submission forms. Just a note that there is a different submission form for policy development, implementation, and evaluation. So if you're submitting your work, just make sure that you're completing the submission form that aligns with the designation that you think is best. I think, Linda, other folks have already iterated this, but we are very, very, very happy to meet with you, talk through your work, help you figure out what designation might be the best fit. So that holds true for policies as well. Next slide, please. So for scoring, this is one thing I did want to make a bit of a distinction, because what we're looking for with scoring is slightly different than for practices. So all submissions to the policy track are reviewed by a team of reviewers with MCH policy knowledge who assess each policy along 4 different dimensions. So those dimensions are evidence, equity, relevance, and impact. So the first dimension of evidence is really thinking about the different ways that existing forms of evidence informed the development or implementation of a policy. For equity, it's really meaning how the policy addresses a health disparity or structural form of oppression. So we're looking to see in what ways the policy work was designed to, has been, or you can demonstrate using evaluation data to show that it's addressing a health disparity or a systemic form of oppression. For relevance, that's thinking about the rationale behind this policy. Does your rationale make sense given what you're trying to accomplish? And then that last dimension of impact is really thinking about what is the intended or observed impact of the policy on the target population. And so in reviewing policies, I should just note that AMCHP's goal is really to include all relevant policy examples that could have relevance to the MCH workforce. And so our goal is not to judge policies, but rather to provide feedback on how to better describe your work and generate suggestions and lessons learned that other folks who might be interested in replicating this work might consider. So that holds true for the practices as well. When we're providing feedback, when your reviewers are providing feedback, the purpose of that is so that to help strengthen future iterations of your work, either that you're doing yourself or for the policy track that other folks might include when they replicate the work. Next question. Or sorry, thank you, next slide. So this is a photo, just a screenshot of the handout. It looks very similar to the practice handout, but slightly different categories. You can visit and explore some of the policies in the database to see more of that. Next slide, please. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Linda to talk about some tips for submitting your work.
Thanks, Laura. So just high level, this applies for both practices and policies, but just wanted to share some things that we have taken note of, I guess, over all of the reviews that we've done. So I think the first one is just to keep in mind that most reviewers are not familiar with your work. And so we really encourage you to write your responses to our various questions as though you're writing to someone who does not know what your practice is or your policy, they've never heard of it. That ensures that you're providing relevant information so that reviewers have a good understanding of what your practice of policy is, what it aims to do and how it does that. The next one is really making sure that if you do have relevant sources or evidence or data, please make sure to include that. The next one is to double check that you've answered all parts of the question. So we do have a handful of questions that have more than one part to them, or there's an embedded question within it. So just make sure, because we have had this happen where folks have missed, one or two of these questions, but just double check the submission form and the questions to make sure that you've actually responded to all of the parts of those questions where they have more than one. Next slide, please. The other thing too is that we know that it's much easier for you, instead of having to write out your evaluation plan or share this information, it can be easier to just link to an existing, report that you have done. But what we would ask you to do is to still provide a full response in the actual application or submission form. It can be very challenging for reviewers. I'm speaking for myself included in that, because all of us have had to serve as reviewers as well. It can be really challenging if you just provide a link to a report and don't answer the question for us to kind of read through this additional information and try to pull out what we think is relevant for that particular question. So you're still welcome to provide a link, but in addition to that, we ask that you also provide a full response to that question in the submission form in addition to that. I think the other one is just a note that for practices, we use that term practice to be inclusive of a number of different things that you might be working on or might be interested in submitting. So really, it's anything that's not a policy, that's just like our differentiating term. And so those are programs, we have tools, we have like training curricula, collaborative structures or models. Those things would all get categorized as a practice. So really anything that's not considered a policy. And I think the biggest tip is really that don't feel like you have to try to struggle for long to understand what the process is or like what you need to do. Like if at any point you're like, I'm stuck, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, this is very unclear, just reach out to us at our evidence email and we're happy to answer your question or hop on a call with you to kind of walk through something with you. Next slide, please. And so this is just kind of high level, some of the frequently asked questions we get with the submissions process that might help you if you are interested in doing this in the future. So in terms of completing a submission, it does vary. I think on average, we used to ask folks like, how long does it take you to submit your practice, to the database? So it does take, we've had folks say as little as 3 hours all the way up to 10+ hours. In general, I think, for folks submitting a cutting edge practice, it tends to be on the lower end of that window. And for folks submitting a best practice, it might be on the higher or the upper end of that. And one reason is that sometimes we're asking you questions about like your evaluation plan or about data, and it might be where you help to create the program, but that data, evaluation information might live in another department or part of your organization that you do not have easy access to. So you might have to build in time to kind of coordinate with someone to get that information. We also know that with folks who maybe it's a partnership that created a practice, they might have to wait on different partners to provide relevant pieces of information to then put together the submissions form. So I've tried to make this as much of a streamlined process and made it where you can pull a lot of this information from existing reports that you have, but just build in time. Again, if you don't have easy access to all that information, you might have to reach out to others to get that and just kind of put that in your timeline. In terms of chances of being accepted, so I think, Laura mentioned this within the context of the policy track, but, for practices as well, we're really, as long as it's a good fit for the database and it seems like something that is not causing unintentional harm and it is, it seems like it's benefiting MCH populations, then we feel like it is, a good fit to be included in the database, and we want to do that. So as much as possible, we're really here to support you to get most of this work into the database, with the caveat that cutting edge practices are time limited. So it's really our goal to help kind of get you in, get you connected to additional support, help you grow and improve your practice to move up the continuum. For others as well, we really want to get as many folks into the database as we can, even at that lowest practice designation. So it's really that entry point for us to continue providing you with substantive, support and resources to continue building out your work. So in general, of all the submissions we have per year, and that does vary, but we maybe have like 2 between 1 to, usually it's 2 practices per year, but anywhere from like 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 per whole year where we might ask folks to consider resubmitting. And usually it's not because they're not a good fit entirely. Usually it's because they're like pre-cutting edge. They're just not quite at the cutting edge level. And we can also work with them to get them to that point to then submit. We talked about the second one in terms of knowing which designation is right for your practice or policy. We have designation criteria for policies, and then we have the minimum criteria checklist for practices that you saw. You can access those on our website. to help you. But then again, if you're reading through either of those and you're not quite sure, reach out to us and we're always happy to hop on a call with you to talk you through that. One thing that we didn't necessarily talk about in terms of the review process is that, and I guess still say this comes to your question a little bit, but once we get your application or your submission and once the reviewers are reviewing it, we then hold review calls with reviewers to look over their scores to see if there are any discrepancies. And there might be places where the reviewers feel that they can't reach a decision on your designation because they need additional information. So that is built into our process. So it's not that, whatever you submitted, that's it. We're not gonna, whatever you submitted is final. We include this process in there to account for the fact that there might be misalignment between our questions and your practice or your policy or, whatever it is that you're submitting. So we do build in time for reviewers to share if there's any additional information that they need in order to make a designation. And then we'll contact you as a part of the review process to share, these are the outstanding questions reviewers have, like, do you have this information? And then we share it with the reviewer to help them make a final determination. After your submission is accepted to the database, we talked about this with practices and policies. The next step for both is essentially to fill out some brief information that helps to populate your landing page in the database. And then you also would fill out your handout. And as much as possible, we try to use what's in your submission form to pre-populate that handout. And then we give it back to you and ask you to take a look at it. And also, if there are a few additional questions that we don't ask in the submission form that we'd ask you to provide at that time as a part of getting accepted. And then the last one is about the Innovation Hub Awards process. And so this is something that we do on an annual basis as a part of the annual AMCHP conference. So on Thursday, we will be announcing the Innovation Hub Award winners through there, and you can also see them on the website. But essentially, for each year, we have 3 awards that we'll offer for practices. So we have one that goes to the highest scoring practice within like that best practice category, so kind of recognizing our best practice that was accepted over the past year. And then we also have ones for practices that move up the continuum, so kind of recognizing that growth. So that's one that we can offer. And that one rotates. The best practice one is one we give every year, and then we have 3 other categories that kind of rotate. So the kind of growth or advancement one is one that rotates depending on what practices you see that year. We also have one for advancing health equity, and then we also have one for kind of collaboration and partnership with others. So those ones do also rotate depending on the types of practices. So everyone, once you get accepted to the database, is eligible for that award. It really comes down to how your practice scores in certain things that we're looking for. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kat, to share a little bit more about those award winners, and then we'll close out and we'll have time for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, so I'm going to be wrapping up this presentation with just a few final slides, and then there'll be questions at the end. So as Linda previously mentioned, these are Innovation Hub Award winners thus far for the year. So the LEND trainees as family navigators and also the infant toddler court teams at both Vanderbilt Kennedy Center and also 0 to 3, they have won awards in empowerment and partnership this year. And then in addition to that, the Family Connects model at the Duke Center for Child and Family Policy, they have won an award for the best practice at the Innovation Hub as well. Next slide. So just to end this presentation, there are a variety of different ways that you can get involved. I'm going to drop these links in the chat right now. But you're available to join the Maternal and Child Health Innovations Committee to support the design, implementation, and improvement of the Innovation Hub. You also have the option to sign up to be a reviewer. And I've dropped those links in the chat below to also refer a practice or policy that you think you would like to see submitted as well. So yeah, now I just want to take this time to ask if there are any questions. I know I saw like some in the chat, but we are all here to help answer these questions that you guys have about the Innovation Hub. So thank you all so much for attending this presentation and listening to what we have to say. And you can feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand or ask any questions in the chat if you would prefer that as well.
So I just want to circle back, Dulce, I know you had the question about the review process, and then we followed up and we kind of shared a little bit more on slides a little earlier, do you still have any outstanding questions about the review process that we can answer for you?
Thank you. No, I don't have questions about the review process. Thank you for sharing the details. I was just wondering about that, how it compares to Home B, but I think, probably I can dive into Home B and see how it compares to this process.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
No, I think that was a good question. So, I mean, I'm familiar with the work overall, but I actually don't know the ins and outs of their review process. So if you do find out, I'm curious to hear, if there is anything that we should think about with our own review process.
Sure, thank you.
You're very welcome. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, Noelle, I think we can go to our last slide. So just wanted to thank you all for joining us on this pre-conference day. We hope that this information was relevant to you. Again, we put the link to the PowerPoint slides in the chat. I guess we could probably drop them in there one more time. But just wanted to thank you all for spending some time with us, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at evidence@amchip.org if you have any questions about anything that we shared related to Innovation Hub, or if you have any other questions related to evidence and implementation at AMCHP, we're happy to chat with you. But again, really thankful and appreciative of your time, and just let us know how we can help. But thank you all.